This is the Roots and All podcast, and I'm your host, Sarah Wilson. Join me as I talk about all aspects of gardening with some of the top horticulturists from around the world. Hello and welcome to this week's episode, where my guest is Miles Hayward. Miles is a dendrophile and keen plantsman who discovered a passion for Japanese maples and soon began to accumulate a wide variety of different cultivars. He started Miles Japanese Maples in 2016, specialising in these trees after becoming frustrated by the lack of good quality trees in garden centres and local nurseries. He now grows high quality plants in relatively small numbers, focusing on quality over quantity. He begins by talking about his horticultural career so far.
I guess I started with maples. I used to work at a nursery just after leaving university, and I was lucky enough to do some of the flower shows. And one of the best things about doing the flower shows is that you get to set up your exhibit. And then once you've done that, you get to wander around and look at the other exhibit the day before the general public come in. So you kind of get like first choice on some of the plants that are for sale. And I remember going to, I think, Hampton Court and Tatton Park, and there used to be some really amazing tree nurseries. And it's when I was first getting into it. And it would be, generally I'd see something that I didn't recognize. And quite often, which I'm sure a lot of plant collectors will relate to, I generally had to buy it because I hadn't seen it before, and you may never see it again. And I remember buying a dwarf maple, which is called Acer-palmatum Mikawa yatsubusa. It's a very rare tree, but it's an amazing plant. And I saw this big tree in the center of a display. Never seen anything like it before. It was probably about 30 or 40 years old, but it was only about 2 feet tall, 2 feet wide, something like that. It looks like a bonsai. And he had one available on his stand. So I bought it. It was very small, and I think it was about 40 or 50 pounds. It's the most I'd ever spent on anything like that. But that's probably what started it. And then so every time we did a flower show, I'd go and have a look round. You get to know some of the nursery people, and you end up buying one here, one there. And sort of before you know it, you've got 40 or 50 trees because they're all so varied. And that very first tree I bought, I still have outside. So that's now 25 years old, and it's about 3 feet tall. And it's an amazing plant.
What a bargain as well, considering its age when you bought it.
Yeah, I hadn't thought of it like that. Yeah, I mean, the hundreds and hundreds of hours of looking after it, watering and feeding, I'll discount. But yeah, no, it really was. It really was. It's a great tree.
And why maples in particular for you?
I suppose it varies as a plant. So Acer-palmatum would be the normal maple that you see everywhere. And it's such a variable tree, probably more so than any other tree species, I would have thought. I'm sure there'll be some tree geeks out there that are correcting them. But Acer-palmatum, we think there's at least over 1,000 cultivars of Acer-palmatum now. When you grow them from seed, they never come true, like a lot of plants, but they always throw up sort of interesting and different forms. That might be the habit of the tree, that might be the leaf shape, the color, but that could be the spring color, the summer color. The autumn color might be different. It might be tall and skinny, or it might be low and wide, big leaves, small leaves. And then obviously, as we get more and more cultivars, then they cross with each other as well. And so it goes on and on and on. I mean, we're perhaps getting to the point where there's sort of too many now. No one can really have all of them. It's just not possible. But the fun bit is still, like I do now, is just grow some more from seed, because you never know what might come up.
And is seed the only way of propagating them?
No. So generally, you have to graft acers. So you have to propagate them vegetatively. So that would normally be with most plants, you would do cuttings. But for a lot of trees, and particularly acers, you need to graft them. So they're grafted. You take a piece of the mother plant that you want to reproduce. You take a piece of that, and then you graft it onto an Acer-palmatum rootstock. And then you have a genetic copy of the mother plant. If you grow them from seed, you may get some that look a bit like the mother plant, but there will be some that don't at all. That's the fun bit, but you can't guarantee that you're going to get exactly the same traits. You do see some cuttings available now, sort of the really cheapy ones that you might find on those trolleys outside the supermarkets and things. They tend to be mass produced in very, very large quantities, and they're very cheap. And generally, they don't survive too well. They never seem to produce such a strong root system, and a strong root system is really important in the maple. So generally, still they're all grafted, and you get a much better tree that way.
I was going to ask you about those, actually, the ones on the supermarket trolleys, but you've kind of answered that question. So if they're all on an Acer palmatum rootstock, does that mean that there's less variation in terms of height and vigour?
No. So actually, yeah, it's odd, isn't it? Because if you grow things like apples, you would use the rootstock to control the size of the tree. So you could graft something would normally get very big onto a dwarf rootstock and it would control the eventual size of the tree. Doesn't seem to happen with maples. I've never really got to the bottom of it. So you can take, say, 100 rootstocks, straight Acer palmatum, which would have been grown from seed, and onto those rootstocks you could graft a little dwarf tree, a dwarf cultivar, but you could also graft onto there a much taller growing tree, and they would reach what you would expect them to reach. So I'm not entirely sure why that is. It doesn't seem to work in quite the same way, but it's always worth experimenting, and I'm sure there'll be someone somewhere around the world who's experimenting with that at the minute.
Sort of winding it back a bit, the name of your nursery is Miles Japanese Maples. So the Japanese maples part, does that just refer to Acer palmatum, or are there other species as well?
There's about 15 Japanese species that are endemic to Japan. There's some really lovely ones. They tend to be slightly larger trees. So there's a few snakebark maples, which are Japanese. There's a lovely tree called Acer micranthum, which has very small leaves and amazing autumn colour, but it's really hard to propagate. That's a native of Japan. There's another one, Acer morifolium, so leaves like a morris or a mulberry. That's an amazing tree, but it's quite tall. Also, you would see Acer japonicum, obviously from Japan. There's various ones of those. They have quite large leaves to them and big buds. And the one that probably most people are familiar with is Acer shirasawanum aureum. So it's called the full moon maple that has bright yellow foliage and almost round in shape. Very slow growing, but it's the classic Japanese tree.
And do they all like broadly the same growing conditions?
On the whole, yeah. So I would always say reasonably sheltered. So don't plant one in a very, very exposed position. They can take a good level of exposure, sort of wind and sun, once the foliage is sort of fully hardened off mid-season or so. But it's very soft growth when it first comes out in the spring, and that can be subject to damage to sort of late frost or cold northerly winds. They're somewhere reasonably sheltered. Ideally, if you can plant them in a position that gets sort of half sun, half shade, that will cover most of them. So half a day of sun will be good enough to provide good colouring. So for the sort of the ready purple forms, need a good amount of sun in order to get the best colour. But also half sun, half shade is good for some of the ones that want a bit of protection from the afternoon sun. So the paler leaf forms, the more yellowy forms tend to like a bit of protection from the hotter afternoon sun. I mean, the absolute idea would be to have them planted somewhere sunny in the morning and then shady in the afternoon, if you want to be really picky. But as a general rule, that's about right. And soil that's not too dry, soil that's not too wet, like a Goldilocks sort of situation. But when you get them in the right spot, they're perfect.
Yeah, it's that fabled moist, well-drained soil, isn't it? But yeah, and thinking about other requirements for them, do they need feeding, or are they quite happy to just look after themselves once you've planted them?
So in the ground, I would say that you don't need to feed them at all. You can make sure that, you could add like a decent mulch every year or every couple of years, which will just sort of naturally feed the soil, or just leave the leaves around the base of the tree. Try not to be sort of too tidy. If you do use any sort of mulch, make sure that it's not mounded up against the bark. So you want to ensure the mulch is doing its job for keeping the soil damp in the sort of warmer, drier parts of the year, and maybe a little bit warmer in the colder parts of the year by providing that sort of insulation, but it doesn't want to come into contact with the trunk because you can get into all sorts of issues sort of fungal wise. And in the ground, I wouldn't worry about feeding too much at all. But if you're growing in a container, then you would, because obviously in a container, you're watering much more often, or you get an awful lot of rain, and that can wash out quite a lot of the nutrients. But you want a fairly low level of nutrition. So I tend to do like a granular top dress of an organic fertilizer in about end of March, beginning of April, which slowly breaks down. And then if you need to, you could always apply a liquid feed sort of early to midsummer, but I wouldn't tend to feed after that. If you feed too late into the year, you can sort of carry on encouraging the tree to grow, which produces sort of more soft growth, which may not harden off by the end of the season. And then you can get like a little bit of dieback later in the year. So yeah, I'd finish feeding sort of midsummer. To be honest, if the tree looks healthy and happy, you may not need to worry at all. Don't just sort of feed for the sake of it.
And are they all suited to growing in containers? And in fact, do some do better in containers than they do in the ground?
No, I would say they would all do better in the ground, particularly the way our weather's going. You know, our summers are getting hotter and drier, or when we get sunny days, they seem to be much more intense. And in a container, obviously the root system can get hot. And in the winter, that root system can also freeze. So in the ground, everything's a little bit more stable, and the trees tend to be much happier. So yeah, they're all absolutely fine in pots, but you really need to be on your game when it comes to sort of watering. In the summer, they don't like to get too dry. You want to make sure that the compost is free draining enough so that they don't get too wet in the winter. I would try to go for glazed pots if possible. They tend not to get too hot and they tend to hold on to a reasonable amount of moisture. I would tend to avoid terracotta. It may not be that fashionable now, but things like the half oak barrels are really good because it's wood. And so they tend to offer this sort of extra layer of insulation and provide a more stable environment for the root system. So they have quite fine roots. And so fluctuations in temperature can be slightly damaging to them.
Are they quite shallow rooted then?
Yes, but they don't tend to have a tap root. And most of their roots are in about the top 10 to 12 inches, if that. So that's why you often see acers can tend to struggle when we have the really dry spell. Once the sort of water tables drop, if you're on a particularly dry soil, once the water tables drop quite low, then you may have to give them some extra water when they're in the ground as well, even on older, more mature trees. Yeah, so quite shallow rooted. So you do need to give them a little bit of assistance, which is why the mulching is a really good idea.
And I'm thinking then maybe they won't like to be underplanted. Is that correct?
Yeah, you could, but maybe with nothing that's sort of aggressive. And it depends on the tree. So if you've got an acer that's likely to get to sort of 8 to 10 feet tall, then you're much more likely to get away with underplanting that than you say you would a dwarf that is only ever going to get to sort of 2 or 3 foot because it would be competing too much. But then things like bulbs work really well. So they can give you a little bit of a spring lift before the tree comes out into leaf. Maybe some of the less aggressive grasses, things like Ophiopogon or Hacknacloa or something like that, they always look good.
And you mentioned that the majority are grafted. Does that mean when you plant them, you need to be careful about the depth that you plant them at?
Absolutely, yes. That's probably the biggest killer of Japanese maples is the depth. So it's really, really important. And I probably go on about this too much to customers, but it's really important. So if you imagine you're in a parkland somewhere, a nice park, and you see like a big oak tree in the ground, when you look at the trunk, it never sort of goes straight down into the ground. You can always see that nice shape as it sort of flares out as it hits the ground. That's called the root flare or the basal flare of the tree. And that should be at soil level. And that's the same with all trees everywhere. So when you're particularly in a pot, you often see them planted too deep. And I don't know why this is, but so a lot of the big commercial growers tend to have the trees with like a lot of top dressing and things on the pot. So they look nice when you go to buy them from a garden centre or wherever. And the thing is, you're always told as a gardener, to plant a tree or a plant at the level it is in the pot, which everyone does. Unfortunately, quite often, the root flare is an inch or two below the surface as you get it into the pot. So you should always kind of dig away at the soil and see whether the base of the trunk starts to flare out, and that should be your soil level. If you think in the natural environment, the seed would fall from the tree and it would only really sort of nestle into the leaf litter and start to grow from there. It doesn't really bury itself into the ground or anything like that. And the main issue with planting too deep is that the top few inches of root, that's where the sort of gaseous exchange happens. So it's where the roots need to breathe. So if they're planted too deep, they can struggle. And then that's then compounded by the fact that some of the trunk and the bark is below soil level, which again can lead to sort of fungal issues, like I mentioned earlier with the mulch. So you should have a nice root flare just coming out and meeting the top of the soil. It also makes the tree look nicer. It gives it kind of more presence. It's the sort of thing that's very much desired in bonsai circles. So that's what would be termed the nabari. So, and that's a much prized thing to have.
So that's very good to know. I think another question that people have, and this I think goes back to actually putting the tree in the right place to start with, but sometimes people may have a desire to prune them. Can you prune them? Are they amenable to that?
Absolutely. Yeah, I prune all of my trees as I go along. And I've been experimenting with pruning for eight or 9 years now, finding out when the best time to do it, because they have a reputation for bleeding. So it's always said that you should prune your maples sort of in the dormant season, like November through till February, something like that. The thing that seems to be happening now is because we're getting these sort of milder winters, apart from the week that we had last week, they never really seem to shut down properly. So I did some pruning a couple of weeks ago when really you would have thought the tree would be dormant. And it was actually sort of slightly dripping from some of the wounds. It's not a major problem, but it's just not a very nice thing to see. So I've actually now been doing some more summer pruning. So you let the tree do its sort of push of growth in the spring, and then July, August or so, when the tree's kind of, if you think it's full of the most amount of energy, it's full of vigor. If you make any sort of cuts on it, then they do tend to heal more quickly. You're less likely to get any sort of fungal infection. So if you think in the winter, it's damp and cold and there's sort of more spores and things around. In the summer, the air's drier and that doesn't tend to happen quite so much. But having said that, so for example, in Japan, they tend to do a lot of their pruning, I think, end of October, beginning of November, something like that, just as the leaves are starting to fall. So I've been experimenting with that a little bit as well, because that's supposed to be when the tree is sort of spending some time shifting nutrients and sap and things around and balancing itself out ready for the winter months. So if you do the pruning then, it kind of goes along with it. I wouldn't really ever do it February, March, April. That's just as they're starting to grow. And they do seem to bleed quite a lot more then. So wait for their first flush of growth and then do it. Make sure, obviously, that super, super sharp tools and nice and clean as well. And if you're moving between plants, make sure you clean your tools between each tree as well.
And are they susceptible to any particular diseases or pests even?
Pests. So not too bad. As with lots of plants, though, pests will tend to go for plants that are a little bit under the weather or a bit sickly. They don't have the same sort of defenses. So you tend to get trees that aren't doing so well. They'd be the ones that are more likely to get, say, issues with aphids. The aphids do love acer leaves when they start to come out in the spring. But you could either physically remove them with your hand. But if you're a little bit squeamish, you could always try like a simple soap spray. That seems to work quite well. They can get some fungal infections. They're renowned for a little bit of dieback. But generally, I would say that's more down to the overall health of the tree. So if you've got a well-grown, healthy tree, then you shouldn't really have any issues at all. It's normally when it's been under some sort of stress, then it gets sort of knocked back a bit. So if a tree, say, is struggling in a pot, say it's been overwatered, and so the root system has struggled and it's maybe got some damage down there for some reason, you can often see it showing in the branches. If a tree's healthy all the way through, then you shouldn't really have any issues at all.
And I think people tend to associate them with Japanese gardens or contemporary planting schemes. In your opinion, do they work in other kind of settings?
Yeah, I think so. I often think if you can, they often make a really good accent plant. They work in almost any situation, I would say. And because you've got such an enormous variety of color, shape, habit, all of those things, they'll work in most positions. Obviously, maybe not in, your sort of hot, dry Mediterranean garden. Although, saying that, there are a couple of Mediterranean species. They're not the most exciting to look at, but it would still work. But then even in, an English cottage garden, there's no reason why you couldn't put in our native Acer campestre, or the field maple. Lovely green leaves with amazing buttery yellow autumn colour. So I would say, because of the variety of maples on the whole, not just Japanese maples, but all, yeah, you could probably find one for every situation.
I'm going to ask you the question that makes all of my guests groan, and that is, what is your favourite one? Although I think in the case of the maples, it might be more useful to kind of phrase that as, are there any that you're particularly excited about at the moment, or are there any that you would say, if you're starting out, this one is just tried and tested and it's fantastic? So maybe more along those lines than your personal favourite, although feel free to mention that as well.
You can imagine it's a nightmare. If I would go almost day to day and I have a new favourite one. So one of my favourites is an old Japanese cultivar, which is Acer palmatum shishigashira. It's got an amazing name, but it's got a really upright form, looks a little bit like an Irish yew, with really small, crinkly leaves. Very dark green for most of the summer, but goes all sorts of oranges and reds in the autumn, and a really nice sort of winter silhouette to it as well. But I'm also, at the minute, I'm growing quite a lot of trident maple from seed, which is Acer burgerianum. I think it's a native of China, but it's been grown in Japan for a really, really long time. Works really well as a bonsai, but it tends to be quite heat tolerant. So it could be a good one for us to use in the future. It's got like a dark green glossy leaf, almost a bit like ivy in color. Trident maple, because it's sort of three-lobed. It's quite a strong grower, but again, really, really good autumn color too. So yeah, that's that at the minute. It will change tomorrow, but at the minute, that's probably one of my favorites.
Okay. Well, I mean, I have reached the end of my questions. The last thing I have to ask you is, if people want to find out more about you and your plants, where might they find you, either online or in person?
Okay, great. Yeah, so the easiest thing probably is my website, which is milesjapanesemaples.co.uk. I'm also on Instagram as Miles Japanese Maples, and Facebook as well. There is only me, and I grow all the trees at home. I probably grow 500-600 trees a year, something like that. It does take quite a while, so they're all grown over a long period of time. This is the trouble with trees. So the ones I grew from seed last year will be ready for sale probably next year. I like to sell them at a size that people won't struggle to get them going. If you start with them very young, sometimes you can, if you have a bad winter or something, you can lose them. So I like to get them to a size where they should reliably get going in people's gardens. Yeah, and I grow everything peat-free and pesticide-free. And all my trees are grown in air pots as well, so they've got really good root systems too.
And if anyone's going to any of the OHS shows, are you going to be there?
Yeah, last year I did Chelsea for the first time, and they're having me back. So I'm doing it again this year. We're doing it as part of a collaboration with a small group of nurseries. We do the Plant Fairs Roadshow in the southeast, and there's a small group of us doing a display together, just like we did last year up at Chelsea. Otherwise, we'll be doing, I think I've got about 12 or 15 plant fairs around the southeast, and all the details and things are on my website for that.
Thank you very much to Miles. A couple of things before I let you go, if I may. I wanted to highlight the work being done by Dave Walmer, who runs Green Heart Horticultural Services in Crewe. Dave is setting up a plant nursery for the benefit of the community that will operate on sustainable principles and be of benefit to every living thing. Dave not only has a green heart, but a big heart, and I know this project will be amazing once he gets it off the ground. I've put a link to the fundraiser in the show notes. If you can contribute financially, that would be awesome. Or maybe give the nursery page a follow on social media. Or reach out to Dave and tell him you believe in what he's doing. Support is support and it's always appreciated. Speaking of which, I received an email from Chartable which sends me a notification when I get a new review of the podcast. So I clicked on it and read some of the recent reviews you've left, and I actually got a bit choked up. They're really, really lovely. Thank you. Thank you for taking the time to write them. They're thoughtful and insightful, and I was really touched. And as always, thank you for listening. You can download or listen to the podcast direct from the website rootsandall.co.uk. Please also check out my Patreon, where you can make a one-off donation or take out a monthly subscription to help support the podcast. Because if you enjoy the show, please help it continue. I also have a GoFundMe where you can make a one-off donation. Even a one-off donation of £1 helps, and I'll be really grateful for your support. So please go to Patreon or GoFundMe and search for Roots and All Podcast.